It was a quiet evening in St. Martin's, Missouri. The small town, known for its peaceful streets and tight-knit community, had always been the kind of place where people felt safe. Where doors were left unlocked, and children roamed freely without fear. The kind of place where everyone knew everyone, and life moved at a calm, predictable pace. But on the night of October 21, 2009, everything changed. Elizabeth Olten, a 9-year-old girl, had been spending time at her friend's house that afternoon. As evening fell, her mother, Cheryl Olten, expected her to be home. But as the hours passed, Elizabeth didn't return. At first, Cheryl thought it was nothing more than a minor delay, a child lost in the excitement of playing. But as time stretched on, the worry began to set in. By the time night had fallen, Elizabeth was nowhere to be found. The clock was ticking, and with every passing hour, the fear and uncertainty grew. Family members, friends, and neighbors began to search, combing the streets, knocking on doors, and scanning the surrounding woods. Local law enforcement quickly mobilized, and soon, the search became a full-scale operation. The quiet town, once immune to the violence and crime seen in larger cities, was suddenly gripped by a sense of dread. Where was Elizabeth? And more importantly, who could have taken her? As the hours turned into days, hope began to wane. The search grew more desperate. The police expanded their efforts, but there was still no sign of Elizabeth. Her disappearance was becoming the town's darkest mystery. What had started as a missing child case soon morphed into something far more unsettling. Who would want to hurt a child in a town where everyone knew each other? Could it be someone from the community? Someone close to her? Someone who had been living among them, hiding in plain sight? And then, just as the town's hope began to fade, a twist would come. One that no one had seen coming. It would force the people of St. Martin's to reckon with the unthinkable. But the question remained, was this the work of a stranger, or had someone closer to home been hiding something much darker? Days passed. The search continued, but no answers were found. And then, on October 23, 2009, the unthinkable happened. A breakthrough came that would change everything. It wasn't a stranger who had taken Elizabeth. The discovery would shake the town to its core, unraveling a web of lies and deception that no one had expected. Who could have committed such an act? Was this truly a random act, or had something been simmering beneath the surface all along? What could have driven someone to do something so horrifying? And how well did the people of St. Martin's really know the individuals they shared their lives with? As the investigation unfolded, new details began to emerge, leading to questions that no one could answer. Who was behind this crime, and what would the truth reveal? Each moment of the investigation feels like it brings them no closer to the truth. The fear of the unknown lingers as the town waits for answers, and viewers are left wondering, what was happening behind the scenes? What secrets were the people of St. Martin's hiding, and who would ultimately be revealed as responsible for this unimaginable act? To understand the horrific events that unfolded in St. Martin's, we must first look at the life of Alyssa Bustamante. A 15-year-old girl living in a small town, Alyssa's story begins with a background filled with emotional turbulence and troubling circumstances. Alyssa had been described by those who knew her as a quiet, withdrawn teenager. She lived with her mother, her siblings, and her grandmother. From the outside, her family seemed typical, but behind closed doors, Alyssa's home life was far from stable. Her mother, who struggled with her own personal issues, often left Alyssa to take care of her younger siblings. This strained responsibility put a significant weight on Alyssa at a young age, and with her mother's lack of support, the teen found herself navigating her emotions alone. Alyssa's father was largely absent from her life, leaving her to deal with the challenges of growing up without a consistent father figure. This absence was keenly felt, and it further compounded her emotional difficulties. As a young girl, she was isolated, struggling to fit in and to understand her place in the world. Her loneliness and lack of support from her family led her to retreat inward, where darker thoughts began to fester. In school, Alyssa didn't have many friends. She was often seen as different, a little out of place compared to her peers. Teachers and students alike noticed her quiet, almost eerie demeanor. Her classmates would later recall that she was distant, often walking the hallways alone, avoiding interactions with others. Despite this, she wasn't completely invisible. A few people reached out to her, trying to get her to open up, but Alyssa remained guarded, too weighed down by her own inner struggles to truly connect with those around her. Despite the isolation she felt, Alyssa's journals were a place where she could voice the chaos inside her. Writing became an outlet for her, but it was also a place where disturbing thoughts began to surface. In her entries, she spoke of feeling numb, of wanting to experience something more intense, even violent. In many of her writings, Alyssa revealed a fascination with death and the darker sides of life, including references to her desire to hurt others. As she entered her teenage years, Alyssa became more troubled. She was known to have frequent outbursts, a sign that the pressure she was under was beginning to manifest in more extreme ways. While her peers were focused on typical adolescent concerns, Alyssa struggled with inner turmoil that she couldn't escape. Teachers noticed her declining grades and unusual behavior but didn't fully understand the depths of the pain she was hiding. Her relationships with others were strained, and while she didn't outwardly show aggression, her behavior began to shift. She became obsessed with topics that many considered morbid, seeking out dark websites and social media groups that connected her with others who shared her feelings. It was during this time that she began to form ideas that would later lead to an unthinkable act. As Alyssa's isolation deepened, the signs of her emotional struggle became harder to ignore. There were moments when her peers noticed something was off, but no one could have predicted what would unfold next. Would she ever find the support she desperately needed, or would the unresolved darkness inside her only grow stronger, pushing her down a path that no one could have foreseen? The answer to that question would soon come in a shocking and tragic way, forever altering the lives of everyone involved. But at this moment, the pieces of Alyssa's story were still hidden behind a veil of secrecy, her inner demons masked by her quiet, withdrawn exterior. But what would happen when these feelings, these dark thoughts, would eventually be pushed to their breaking point? Alyssa's story was far from over, and what came next would send shockwaves through her community. While Alyssa's story began in darkness, the life of Elizabeth Olten shone with innocence and promise. Elizabeth, a 9-year-old girl, was everything that Alyssa wasn't. She was the light in the room, a beacon of energy in the quiet, small town of St. Martin's, Missouri. To know Elizabeth was to know joy. She was a girl who loved life, full of laughter and wonder. Her world, although small, was full of adventure. She spent her days surrounded by family and friends, enjoying the simple pleasures of childhood. The Olten family was close-knit. Elizabeth's mother, Cheryl, and her younger sister were her closest companions. The bond between the three was palpable, warm, comforting, and strong. They would often spend time together, cooking, watching movies, and playing games in their cozy home. Elizabeth was always eager to help out, especially when it came to taking care of her younger sister, showing a maturity that belied her age. Cheryl described Elizabeth as the kind of child who always looked out for others, a loving, caring soul who brought smiles wherever she went. Elizabeth loved to be outdoors. Whether it was riding her bike down the quiet streets of their neighborhood, playing hide-and-seek with friends, or just walking around their peaceful town, she embraced every moment. St. Martin's, with its tree-lined streets and charming homes, was the perfect place for a child to grow up, and Elizabeth made the most of every day. Her laughter echoed through the neighborhood as she played, and she often greeted her neighbors with a warm smile. But beyond the bike rides and the laughter, Elizabeth also had dreams. She was a bright student in school, with a love for reading and learning. She was often seen with a book in her hand, her face lit up by the pages she would flip through eagerly. Teachers and classmates alike admired her curiosity and determination to excel. Elizabeth's future seemed as bright as the sun shining down on the small town she called home. Elizabeth's relationship with her family was grounded in love. Cheryl, her mother, was her rock, and Elizabeth adored her younger sister. They were inseparable. The days were simple, yet filled with love. Elizabeth's smile was a constant presence in the Olten household, and her energy was infectious. Her family couldn't imagine a world without her in it, and they cherished every moment they had together. But on the evening of October 21st, 2009, everything changed. Elizabeth had spent the day with her friend, just a short walk from home. She had told her mother she would be home soon, and Cheryl had expected her to walk back as usual. The sky was beginning to fade into the soft colors of evening, but as the minutes passed and the hours ticked by, Elizabeth didn't come home. Cheryl waited, growing increasingly worried. It wasn't like Elizabeth to be late, and the silence was unsettling. The night deepened, and Cheryl's worry turned to fear. She called Elizabeth's friend, asking if she had left her house yet. No one had seen her. And then, as the minutes turned into an agonizing hour, Cheryl knew something was wrong. Her little girl was missing. In a town where such things didn't happen, this was unimaginable. A flood of emotions overwhelmed Cheryl: fear, dread, disbelief. Her daughter, the girl with the big smile and the even bigger heart, had vanished into the night. As the hours passed, the search became more frantic. What started as a quiet night in St. Martin's had now become a race against time, one that no one could have ever imagined would end in tragedy. Who would do something so unimaginable to a young girl like Elizabeth? And where was she? But where was Elizabeth Olten? And what had happened to her on that fateful night that would change the lives of her family, and her entire community, forever? The peaceful town of St. Martin's, Missouri, had never witnessed anything like this before. The quiet streets of St. Martin's, usually filled with the laughter of children and the hum of evening activity, became ominously silent. The small town, which had always been a place of safety, was now gripped by an unsettling fear. As Elizabeth failed to return home, her mother, Cheryl Olten, began to panic. The minutes ticked by, then hours, and the reality began to set in: Elizabeth was not coming home. The search for Elizabeth intensified as the town united, combing the streets, the nearby woods, and every corner of the neighborhood. But as the night wore on, no sign of the young girl was found. Desperation began to build. And then, just as hope was starting to fade, the investigation revealed a chilling truth. The next day, October 22nd, the search continued with no progress. But authorities were beginning to focus on a potential lead, and it was then that Alyssa Bustamante's name was first linked to the case. At first, Alyssa's involvement was nothing more than a suspicion. She had been one of the many volunteers helping in the search, and nothing about her seemed immediately out of place. She was a local teenager, a friend of Elizabeth's, and she had been among the last to see her before she disappeared. But as the investigation continued, strange details about Alyssa's behavior began to emerge. Her aloofness, her disjointed answers to police questions, and her strange calmness raised the first red flags. The breakthrough came when a tip-off led police to an area near Alyssa's house. There, they found Elizabeth's body, buried in a wooded area not far from Alyssa's home. What had seemed like a simple missing person case had now become a murder investigation. Alyssa's involvement in the crime was soon revealed, and the community was left stunned by the shocking discovery. Alyssa, after being confronted with evidence, eventually admitted to the crime. She confessed that she had lured Elizabeth to the woods under the pretense of wanting to play, then proceeded to kill her. The manner in which Elizabeth was murdered was chilling. Alyssa had strangled her, then buried her body. What could have driven a 15-year-old girl to commit such a horrific act? The investigation revealed that Alyssa had been harboring dark, violent thoughts for some time. Her journals, which would later be examined, showed a fascination with death and violence. She had written about her desire to experience what it was like to take a life, and it was clear that she had been planning the murder for weeks. Elizabeth had been nothing more than a victim of Alyssa's warped desires, a helpless target in a horrifyingly calculated act of violence. The investigation's initial progress had turned the quiet town upside down. What had been an ordinary evening in a small, peaceful town had now led to a tragedy that no one could have predicted. How could someone so young, a girl from the same town, a girl who had known Elizabeth, commit such an unthinkable crime? And why? The answers would only come as the investigation delved deeper into Alyssa's troubled history, revealing a mind warped by emotional pain and a fascination with death. The question that now lingered in the air: how could a 15-year-old girl, someone many had known as a friend, as a neighbor, turn into a cold-blooded killer? And what twisted thoughts had driven Alyssa to end the life of a young girl who had trusted her? As the details of the crime unfolded, the investigation would continue to unravel, leading to revelations that no one in St. Martin's could have ever imagined. But one thing was clear. Alyssa's role in the murder was just the beginning of a much deeper, much darker story. The discovery of Elizabeth Olten's body, buried just a short distance from Alyssa Bustamante's home, sent shockwaves through the small town of St. Martin's, Missouri. What had started as a missing persons case had now become a full-fledged murder investigation. The peaceful, close-knit community that had always trusted in its sense of security was left reeling. But how had this tragedy occurred? And how did someone so close to Elizabeth, someone the community thought they knew, become a cold-blooded killer? The initial stages of the investigation began with the realization that this was no longer a simple case of a missing child. The police now had to piece together a web of clues that seemed to point in one disturbing direction: Alyssa Bustamante. At first, there was nothing unusual about Alyssa's involvement. As a local teenager and a friend of Elizabeth's, she had participated in the search for the missing girl. Alyssa had joined her neighbors, volunteers, and law enforcement officers as they scoured the woods, calling Elizabeth's name in the hopes of finding any trace of the 9-year-old. She seemed to be doing what anyone else would do in such a situation, helping out, searching, praying for Elizabeth's safe return. However, as investigators began to interview those involved in the search, something began to seem off about Alyssa's behavior. Witnesses later reported that she seemed unusually calm, almost detached, in comparison to the others. While others were frantic, upset, and visibly emotional, Alyssa didn't appear to show any of the typical signs of concern or distress. This lack of emotion, combined with her vague answers during initial questioning, raised suspicions. She had been one of the last people to see Elizabeth alive, and yet she seemed almost indifferent to the growing tragedy. The breakthrough in the investigation came when a tip-off led police to a secluded area near Alyssa's home. The wooded patch, hidden away from the main roads, was eerily quiet. There, hidden beneath the earth, they found Elizabeth's lifeless body. The discovery confirmed what had already begun to surface: this was no ordinary disappearance. The circumstances surrounding the death would soon paint a much darker picture. The investigators now had the grim task of piecing together the details of how Elizabeth had been lured to her death. Alyssa's eventual confession would shed light on the chilling sequence of events. According to Alyssa, she had invited Elizabeth to the woods under the false pretense of wanting to play. But once they were isolated, Alyssa's plan turned deadly. She had strangled Elizabeth, then buried her body in the woods. But why? Why would a 15-year-old girl commit such a horrific act? The answer, as the investigation would later reveal, lay in Alyssa's dark, troubled mind. She had been harboring violent fantasies for some time, and Elizabeth had become a target for her desire to experience the thrill of taking a life. Alyssa's journals, discovered later, would offer disturbing insight into her state of mind. Her writings revealed an obsession with death and violence, and she had expressed a desire to see what it was like to kill someone. Alyssa had written about her fascination with the idea of murder, and Elizabeth, with her bright smile and innocent nature, had unknowingly become a victim of Alyssa's twisted fantasies. As the pieces of the puzzle came together, the investigation took a darker turn. It wasn't just a random act of violence. This was premeditated. Alyssa had been planning the murder for some time, and Elizabeth was nothing more than a victim of her disturbed fantasies. But how had it all started? What had pushed a young girl, seemingly a friend, to commit such a brutal crime? The answers would come, but they would be hard to hear, and even harder to accept. As the investigation unraveled, one thing became clear: Alyssa's motives went far beyond what anyone could have imagined. But what had truly driven her to take the life of someone she once called a friend? The investigation into Elizabeth's murder continued, each new revelation sending shockwaves through the town. The pieces of the case, Alyssa's involvement, her cold demeanor, the evidence that tied her to the crime, formed a disturbing narrative. But there were still more questions to be answered. Why had Alyssa chosen Elizabeth? What was it about the young girl that made her a target? And how deep did Alyssa's darkness run? As the investigation continued, the pieces of the puzzle were slowly falling into place. Despite the overwhelming evidence, one crucial element was still missing: the truth. The investigators had gathered clues, interviewed witnesses, and pieced together the sequence of events, but one question remained unanswered: why? Why would Alyssa Bustamante, a 15-year-old girl with a seemingly normal life, commit such an unthinkable act? The breakthrough came unexpectedly, not through more evidence or new clues, but from the person at the center of the investigation herself, Alyssa Bustamante. Just when the investigation seemed to stall, Alyssa's confession would change everything. In a tense, emotional moment, Alyssa broke her silence. The police had been questioning her for hours, but it wasn't until they laid out the evidence before her, pictures of the crime scene, the witness statements, and the mounting pressure, that Alyssa finally admitted what she had done. Alyssa's confession sent shockwaves through the room. The details she provided about the murder were chilling. The words came out coldly, as if recounting a tale that didn't belong to her. She had chosen her method, her victim, and her location with eerie precision. Alyssa spoke of her fascination with death, the desire to experience the thrill of taking someone's life. Elizabeth, with her bright smile and innocent heart, was the target of Alyssa's. As the confession continued, Alyssa described how she buried Elizabeth's body, hiding it beneath the dirt and leaves in the woods near her home. The process was methodical, detached, as if she were completing a task rather than committing an act of murder. What was even more chilling was Alyssa's lack of remorse. She spoke of the crime with a disturbing sense of nonchalance, recounting the events with little emotional reaction. But it wasn't just the details of the murder that were shocking, it was the darkness that had been building inside Alyssa for months, maybe even years. In her confession, she spoke of her obsession with death, of her desire to experience the act of killing, and of the fascination she had developed with violence. Her journals, which had been seized earlier in the investigation, further revealed the depth of her inner turmoil. The writings were filled with dark fantasies, thoughts about death, and references to her growing urge to take someone's life. Elizabeth had become the perfect victim, her innocence and kindness making her a tragic target for Alyssa's warped desires. The police had no choice but to confront the chilling reality: Alyssa had killed her friend, a girl she had known for years, without any real provocation. There was no known motive, no feud or personal grudge. Just a troubled mind seeking an outlet for its darkness. But what drove Alyssa to commit such a horrific crime? Was she truly the mastermind, or was there something deeper at play, hidden within the darkness of her mind? The answers, as they always do, lay buried in her past, a past that was now coming to light in the most horrifying way. The community had lost its innocence, and Alyssa's confession marked the beginning of a new chapter in the investigation, one that would continue to uncover the depths of her disturbing mind. Alyssa's history of mental health struggles, violent tendencies, and a turbulent home life offered some insight into the dark forces that had shaped her actions. To understand the crime, one must first examine the psychological state of the person behind it. Alyssa's story was not one of impulsive violence, but of a young girl consumed by dark thoughts and emotions, many of which had been festering for years. She had always been a troubled child, exhibiting signs of emotional distress long before the murder of Elizabeth. From an early age, Alyssa struggled with her mental health. She was described as withdrawn, isolated from her peers, and prone to sudden emotional outbursts. Her childhood, which should have been a time of growth and safety, was marred by a deep sense of abandonment and isolation. Her mother, who had her own struggles with mental health, often left Alyssa to care for her younger siblings. This forced independence at such a young age placed a heavy burden on Alyssa, and it wasn't long before she began to retreat further into herself. Alyssa's journals, which had been seized by police during the investigation, revealed a disturbing side of her personality that few had known. In these private writings, Alyssa spoke of a growing fascination with death. She detailed her violent fantasies, often describing graphic thoughts about killing. But it wasn't just the act of violence that consumed her, it was the desire to feel what it was like to take a life. In these journal entries, she expressed a longing for something more intense, more real than the life she was living. She wanted to feel power, control, and fear, the feelings she imagined came with taking someone else's life. Psychologists later explained that Alyssa's violent tendencies were not born overnight but had been gradually building over time. She had been exposed to emotional neglect and had not received the support she needed to process her emotions in a healthy way. Her need for validation, her craving for control, and her growing detachment from the people around her culminated in the horrifying murder of Elizabeth Olten. Elizabeth, with her innocence and purity, became a target, a symbol of everything that Alyssa lacked in her own life. Alyssa's troubled home life also played a significant role in shaping her behavior. Raised by a mother who struggled with her own issues and a father who was largely absent, Alyssa was left to navigate her adolescence with little guidance or support. Her family dynamic, combined with her emotional and psychological challenges, created the perfect storm for a mind that was already predisposed to violence. As Alyssa's story unfolded in the media and in court, many people began to question how such a young girl could harbor such violent tendencies. Some argued that it was the lack of parental involvement and guidance that led to her detachment, while others pointed to the deeper, more troubling issues with her mental health. Whatever the cause, the reality was clear: Alyssa's psychological state had played a critical role in the murder of Elizabeth Olten. But was Alyssa's disturbed mind the sole cause of this horrific crime? Or was there something deeper, something buried in her past, that made her capable of such a brutal act? The answers to these questions would lie in the unraveling of her darkest secrets. Alyssa's confession and the investigation into her motives were just the beginning. What followed would reveal a truth that the town, and the world, wasn't prepared to hear. The darkness inside her had been growing for years, and Elizabeth Olten had tragically become its victim. After Alyssa Bustamante's shocking confession and the extensive investigation into her life and the crime, the case quickly became one of national attention. The small town of St. Martin's, Missouri, had been rocked to its core by the brutal murder of 9-year-old Elizabeth Olten, and now the entire country was watching closely as Alyssa, the young girl at the center of this unimaginable tragedy, would face the consequences of her actions in a court of law. Alyssa was charged with first-degree murder, a charge that carried the possibility of life imprisonment. The severity of the crime, coupled with her cold demeanor and detailed confession, seemed to cement the belief that Alyssa's actions were premeditated. However, in an unexpected twist, Alyssa pled guilty to second-degree murder, a charge that was not as severe as first-degree murder but still carried a significant penalty. The question that loomed over the case was simple, yet complex. Why did Alyssa's legal team pursue this plea deal? Was it an attempt to protect a troubled teenager from the full weight of the law, or was it an acknowledgement of the mitigating factors in her life, such as her mental health struggles and difficult upbringing? The case, which captivated the media, became a highly debated subject. Many wondered whether a 15-year-old girl, who had confessed to such a brutal crime, should be treated differently from an adult. Her defense argued that Alyssa's history of emotional and psychological neglect, combined with her violent fantasies and emotional instability, meant that she was not fully responsible for her actions. They argued that Alyssa's troubled past, including her mother's inability to care for her and her father's absence, played a pivotal role in her psychological breakdown. However, the prosecution painted a much darker picture of Alyssa. They emphasized the cold, calculated nature of her actions and her lack of remorse, despite the severity of the crime. Elizabeth Olten, a girl who had trusted her, had been murdered by someone who had known her well. The prosecution argued that this was not an impulsive act, but rather a premeditated crime fueled by Alyssa's violent fantasies. They argued that her fascination with death, as seen in her journals, was a reflection of her deep-seated desire for control and power, which she sought to fulfill through the act of killing. The emotional impact of the case was most deeply felt by Elizabeth's family. Cheryl Olten, Elizabeth's mother, had lost her daughter in a way that no parent should ever have to experience. Throughout the trial, her grief was evident. The courtroom was a place where she had to relive the painful details of her daughter's death, details she had hoped to never know. Yet, despite the overwhelming pain, Cheryl remained determined to ensure that justice was served, even if it meant facing the person who had taken her daughter's life. Alyssa's plea of guilty to second-degree murder meant that she avoided a full trial, where the full scope of her actions and motivations would have been laid bare for the public to examine. But the question remained, was justice truly served? Was the legal system too lenient on a troubled young girl who had taken the life of an innocent child? And how would the community, the Olten family, and the nation come to terms with a justice system that seemed to balance mental health struggles against the severity of a brutal crime? The courtroom sounds are filled with the weight of the proceedings, gavel strikes, the murmur of the audience, and the tense silence as the defense and prosecution make their arguments. Dramatic music swells at key moments, heightening the emotional intensity of the trial. The sound of the gavel is heavy, signifying the weight of the decision that will come. As the trial drew to a close, the decision was left to the judge. Alyssa, having pled guilty, was sentenced to life in prison with the possibility of parole. This verdict, while it provided a sense of closure to some, left many questioning the fairness of the sentence. Was this a just punishment for the brutal murder of a young girl? Could Alyssa be rehabilitated, or was she too dangerous to ever be released back into society? As Alyssa was led away in handcuffs, the question lingered, was justice truly served, or had the system been too lenient on a girl who had shown no remorse for her actions? Was there more to her story than met the eye, and what would happen next in the long, complicated aftermath of this shocking crime? The trial was over, but the emotional impact of Alyssa's actions would continue to reverberate through the town, the families involved, and the public who had followed the case. The search for answers, for justice, and for understanding would continue long after the gavel fell. The trial of Alyssa Bustamante and the shocking murder of Elizabeth Olten left an indelible mark on the small town of St. Martin's, Missouri. While the legal proceedings had reached their conclusion with Alyssa being sentenced to life in prison with the possibility of parole, the emotional aftermath of the case was far from over. In fact, the repercussions of Elizabeth's tragic death continued to echo across the nation, sparking discussions that went far beyond the courtroom and touched on issues of juvenile justice, mental health, and the capacity for violence in young offenders. This case brought to the forefront a difficult question that many people were struggling to answer. How should the justice system handle cases involving young offenders, particularly those like Alyssa, who displayed clear signs of psychological instability? Should the focus be on rehabilitation, or should the severity of the crime demand a punishment that matches the gravity of the offense, regardless of the perpetrator's age? Alyssa's troubled upbringing was at the heart of the debate. Experts pointed to her history of neglect, emotional isolation, and mental health struggles as contributing factors in the crime. Alyssa's defense team argued that her actions were the result of a deeply troubled mind, shaped by a tumultuous family life and years of emotional neglect. In their view, she was a victim of her circumstances, an isolated teenager who had never received the proper care or support to address her psychological issues. Her journals, filled with violent fantasies and references to her desire to experience death, painted a chilling picture of a young mind unraveling under the weight of emotional pain and loneliness. But on the other side, the prosecution and many members of the public felt that the crime could not be excused by Alyssa's troubled past. They believed that Alyssa had shown a disturbing lack of remorse for her actions, and that her premeditated murder of Elizabeth, a young girl she had known and befriended, was indicative of a much deeper, darker inclination toward violence. The fact that she had planned the murder, written about it in her journals, and executed it with such chilling precision painted a picture of someone who was aware of what they were doing, yet carried out the act regardless of the consequences. The emotional coldness she exhibited throughout the trial, combined with her confession, raised questions about the extent to which she could be rehabilitated. The case also raised questions about how the legal system deals with young offenders. Should a 15-year-old girl, no matter how troubled, be sentenced to life in prison with the possibility of parole? Was this justice for Elizabeth Olten and her grieving family? Or was it too lenient, offering Alyssa the potential for release while her victim would never have the chance to experience life again? The case also sparked a larger conversation about the role of mental health in criminal behavior. In the aftermath, many questioned whether enough attention had been paid to Alyssa's psychological state earlier in her life. Experts argued that mental health issues in young people often go unnoticed or untreated, leading to tragic outcomes. For Alyssa, the lack of early intervention and the absence of a stable support system created the perfect storm for a violent crime. Yet, there was no clear consensus on how the system could have prevented such an act or whether it would have made a difference in Alyssa's behavior. The national debate surrounding Alyssa's case became a rallying point for advocates of juvenile justice reform, who argued that more attention needed to be given to the treatment of young offenders, particularly those with mental health issues. But even as these discussions unfolded, the pain and sorrow of the Olten family were left unaddressed. Elizabeth's death was a stark reminder that, no matter the circumstances, a young life had been taken, and no legal ruling could ever bring her back. As the dust settled and the community began to rebuild, one question remained: what does justice truly mean when it involves young offenders like Alyssa? Can a broken system be repaired, or are some crimes simply too terrible to reconcile with the complexities of mental illness and troubled pasts? The case had left scars, not only on the Olten family but on everyone who followed it. And for Alyssa, the consequences of her actions would follow her for the rest of her life, even as society struggled to understand how a young girl could turn into a killer. In the end, Alyssa Bustamante's crime shocked the world. A young girl, barely more than a child herself, took the life of another, someone she had known and once called a friend. The brutality of the act, combined with the cold, detached manner in which it was carried out, left an indelible mark not just on St. Martin's, but on the entire nation. But as the trial concluded and Alyssa was sentenced, another question lingered in the air, one that would haunt the public long after the gavel fell. Can we ever truly know the darkness within someone we trust? Elizabeth Olten, a 9-year-old girl who had been full of life, had her future stolen from her, and her family would forever feel the void left by her absence. The loss was irreparable, and the pain of that loss extended far beyond the walls of the Olten household. St. Martin's, a place once synonymous with safety and comfort, had now become forever marked by tragedy. The town would never be the same. The trial was over, but the larger societal conversation was just beginning. Alyssa's case raised crucial questions about the justice system's handling of young offenders, especially those like Alyssa, who clearly showed signs of deep psychological distress. Was she a product of her environment, a troubled, neglected child who lacked the support she needed to navigate her tumultuous emotions? Or was she a cold-blooded killer who, despite her age, understood the weight of her actions and chose to act on her violent desires? In the months following the trial, the nation grappled with the implications of the case. Some argued that Alyssa's upbringing, filled with emotional neglect and a lack of parental care, was a significant factor in her descent into violence. Others pointed to her journals, her violent fantasies, and the premeditated nature of her actions, suggesting that she may have been more calculating and aware of her actions than many were willing to admit. As the case continued to ripple through the media, the discussion about juvenile justice intensified. Legal experts and psychologists alike debated whether Alyssa's sentence was too lenient. Could a 15-year-old, no matter how troubled, truly understand the consequences of her actions? Was she capable of rehabilitation, or was she a danger to society that could never be reformed? Alyssa's sentencing raised difficult questions about the role of mental health in criminal behavior. Advocates for mental health reform argued that more attention should be given to the mental health of young offenders, especially those like Alyssa, who showed signs of deep psychological turmoil. Early intervention, they said, could have made a difference. But for Elizabeth, the tragic reality remained: no amount of psychological understanding could bring her back. The pain that the Olten family experienced would never be healed, no matter the outcome of the case. As the dust settled in St. Martin's and the community began to rebuild, one question lingered: what can we learn from this case? Was Alyssa a product of a broken system, a victim of her circumstances? Or was she simply a young girl who chose to embrace the darkness within herself, regardless of the help she could have received? What role do we, as a society, play in the creation of violent offenders, and how can we prevent tragedies like this from happening again? The questions remain unanswered, and perhaps they always will. For Alyssa Bustamante, the consequences of her actions will follow her for the rest of her life. And for Elizabeth Olten, her family, and her community, the scars of her loss will never fade. As the nation continues to grapple with the complexities of juvenile justice, the tragic story of Elizabeth's murder serves as a reminder that sometimes, even those we trust the most can harbor darkness that we may never see coming. In the end, we are left to ask ourselves, what would justice look like for a young girl like Alyssa, and can we truly prevent the darkness within from ever breaking free? The story of Elizabeth Olten may be over, but the questions it raises are far from resolved. As the credits roll, the haunting reflection of this story stays with us, reminding us that the darkness can sometimes be closer than we think. In 2024, nearly 15 years after Alyssa Bustamante had been convicted for the brutal murder of Elizabeth Olten, she faced her first chance for parole. The case, which had captured the nation's attention and sparked debates about juvenile justice, would now lead to another significant moment in the life of the young woman who had taken the life of an innocent child. Alyssa, now 30 years old, had spent the better part of her teenage and adult life behind bars, where she had undergone various psychiatric evaluations, participated in rehabilitation programs, and attempted to reframe her troubled past. But the path to parole was anything but straightforward, especially with new legislative changes that would affect her eligibility. In recent years, the legal landscape surrounding juvenile offenders had shifted. Changes in how courts handle cases involving minors, particularly those like Alyssa, who had committed such a heinous crime at a young age, had been implemented. In 2012, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled that mandatory life sentences without the possibility of parole for juveniles were unconstitutional. However, this decision didn't mean that all juvenile offenders automatically received parole after a set period of time. Instead, it meant that more careful consideration would be given to each case, focusing on the offender's potential for rehabilitation and the circumstances surrounding the crime. By 2024, Missouri, like many other states, had enacted stricter guidelines for juvenile offenders who were eligible for parole. The new rules emphasized a comprehensive review of the offender's mental health history, their behavior during imprisonment, and the severity of the crime. For someone like Alyssa, who had committed a premeditated murder at just 15 years old, the rules now included heightened scrutiny. The system was no longer focused solely on whether an offender had served their time, but on whether they had demonstrated genuine remorse and the ability to reintegrate into society without posing a risk to public safety. As Alyssa stood before the parole board in 2024, she expressed remorse for her actions. She acknowledged the horror of what she had done, even though many believed her regret had come only after being caught. Her defense team argued that she had made progress, that she had undergone therapy and had been reformed during her years in prison. Yet, for every step forward she claimed to have taken, there was the undeniable reality of the crime she had committed. Cold, premeditated, and with no clear reason other than her violent desires. Despite her attempts to present herself as a rehabilitated individual, the parole board was not convinced. The board, reviewing the new parole rules, found that Alyssa had not shown sufficient evidence of genuine remorse or the emotional development needed to be released. The brutal nature of her crime, along with her age at the time, was a factor that loomed heavily over her potential release. The fact that she had been fully aware of her actions, planned the murder, and executed it with chilling precision, was not lost on the parole board. In a shocking turn, the parole board decided to deny Alyssa's request for parole. The decision was made based on both the severity of her crime and the board's belief that Alyssa had not yet demonstrated the necessary emotional growth to be reintegrated into society. Under the new guidelines, she would be required to serve another mandatory 30 years before being considered again for parole. This ruling shocked many who had followed the case, as it set a precedent for how the justice system would handle cases involving juvenile offenders who had committed violent crimes. As the clock ticks forward, Alyssa Bustamante's life remains tied to the prison walls that have kept her confined since the night she took Elizabeth Olten's life. Despite her expressions of remorse, her past, marked by violence, troubled mental health, and the brutal nature of her crime, has yet to be fully reconciled. The new parole rules that led to her denial serve as a stark reminder that justice, even in the case of a young offender, is not just about rehabilitation, it is also about the protection of society and the need to consider the nature of the crime itself. Alyssa will now face another 30 years before she is given another chance to prove herself. But for the Olten family, no amount of time will ever heal the wound that has been left by the senseless death of their daughter. The question remains, can we ever truly know the darkness within someone we trust? And how many more families will have to endure this heartbreak before we fully understand how to prevent such tragedies? As we come to the end of this chilling tale, we're left with more questions than answers. But the truth doesn't end here. Tomorrow, we dive into another chilling case, one with more twists, more secrets, and more darkness than you can imagine. It's a story that will keep you on the edge of your seat, wondering what will happen next. You won't want to miss it. Don't forget to subscribe, like, and hit that notification bell so you never miss a new video. Return tomorrow for more as we uncover another gripping true crime case. Trust me, you won't want to miss what's coming next.